Hello there, and welcome to episode 36 of The Piping Show. I'm Andrew Bova, your host this week, coming to you from the National Piping Center, where this week I'll be joined by Alan Forbes. As usual, if you enjoy this content, please like, share, and subscribe, all the things that we always ask you to do. Without any further ado, let's go to Helen Urquhart with this week's news.
On Saturday the 3rd of June, the most recent Competition League for Amateur Solo Pipers in-person contest took place at the National Piping Centre, McFater Street. The overall Grade 1 winner was Theo Pratt, in Grade 2 it was Donald Morrison, and in Grade 3 James Aitchison. Congratulations to everyone who took part on the day. Saturday the 3rd of June also saw the Mark Inch Highland Games taking place. The overall champion there was Ben Duncan. On the same day in New Zealand, Brendan Eade won the overall solo piping champion at the King's Birthday Solo Piping Championship. This Saturday, the first pipe band major contest of 2023 takes place in Lurgan, Northern Ireland. Good luck to all the bands that are taking part. And last week, the Competition League for Amateur Solo Pipers announced the first ever World Amateur Champion of Champions Solo Piping Contest, which will take place on Saturday the 24th of April 2024. There are 10 qualifying events across the world, and you can find out more about all of this at www.theclasp.co.uk.
Alan, thank you for joining me for this history segment. Now, our dedicated viewers at home might recognize this book, this being Bob Brown's copy of Kilmore by General Thomason, which we've featured on the show before. I mentioned in that episode that this book came in as a part of a collection of Bob Brown's materials, and interestingly, two of those bits of material were handwritten copies of both Kilmore and Angus Mackay's collection of Pibroch. Now, Alan very fortunately managed to get away with the handwritten copies for a wee while and has kind of been studying them. And I thought maybe we could show the books in comparison to the originals.
Sure.
And maybe look at some of the similarities and differences. Yeah. So we have here Kilmore. And maybe tell us just a wee bit about some of the things you noticed in studying this book.
Well, Kilmore originally was a small dumpy book like that, and the intention of that was that it would be a book which could easily be carried around Highland Games by judges and by competing pipers. And it was first published in 1900 by General Charles Thomason. Much of the work, I think, having been done while he was in India. He was an army officer in India. And at that time, that compilation was probably just about all of the Pibroch that were known at the time. And for some reason, the person who did this, who was Pipe Major Mackay from Aberdeen, decided to copy out the whole content of that book in longhand, which is an amazing achievement. Thomason himself had his own shorthand for representing the embellishments in Pibroch, and it was all contained in this book, very tightly printed in small print, so that it would be easily transportable. And what this gentleman has done is to reproduce the whole thing in handwriting, which is just quite amazing, including all of the Thomason shorthand.
But interestingly, in some of these sort of originals from Thomason, he actually stacks the variations on top of one another. Yeah. So you know your Schul or your Tarloet would be printed on top of one another in one line.
Exactly.
And this gentleman has expanded it out to be maybe slightly more legible.
He has done that, yes. I think it will be more legible, and there is more space accorded to it, I think. And anything that was cramped or illegible, he's clarified to some extent. So it's an evolution of the book rather than an absolute copy. Mm-hmm. But all of the shorthand stuff is as Thomason had it. Mm-hmm. The other thing that we noticed when we were looking through it is that the slope of the
note heads and the note stems,
yes. Which are to the right here, and in Thomason they are to the left. Now this is another puzzle for us, and I'm not quite sure why it came out like this, but maybe this gentleman's own style of writing just was to write the notes in that way. But we'll have to try and look into that and find out.
There's certainly a bit of research to be done here. But it's also just a great visual representation of how useful this book would have been at the time.
Absolutely.
You know, when you compare the size, the size of this book that contains everything that's in this small copy. And then just very quickly, we also have a handwritten copy of Angus Mackay's collection. If we just open these up to show. And again, the gentleman who copied this, and we're not sure if it's the same gentleman who's done it or a different sort of person. We were trying to do some comparison of the handwriting this morning, but unfortunately we're not handwriting experts. But has certainly copied out all of the text in full, as well as the full of the music.
Yes, Angus Mackay's book was published first in 1838, I think, and it went on to a second edition a few years later, but then was out of print for many, many years until it was reprinted or republished by Seamus McNeill in, I think, the early 1970s. So at the time that this handwritten copy was done, neither of these two books would have been in print. So presumably the person who did them copied them out by hand in order to have his own copies of them.
We were talking about that this morning. It's something that I think sometimes we take for granted now, is if you need a bit of music, you know, and it's out of print, photocopying is available. But 50 years ago,
exactly,
your hand and a pen was the photocopier. Well, Alan, thank you for bringing these back. Thanks for the conversation this morning about them and sharing a little bit of insight about these books. These books are, as I mentioned, a part of a collection that was donated from Bob Brown's library. If you'd like to see these books, come in and study them and engage with them, they are available, and they're not on public display, but they're a part of our rare and valuable books collection. Now, typically, this is when I would say, thanks for joining us. Of course, thank you for joining us, but we've just come out of doing the history segment, so it's a natural progression. So I'll start by asking, how did you get your start in piping?
When I was 6 years old, we lived in Pennycook, and at the Pennycook Gala Day, I saw a pipe band, and I thought it was absolutely wonderful. I can still see them in my mind's eye. I still know the tune they were playing. Pipe Major Norman or Ewing. Major Norman or Ewing, I should say. And a year later, we moved to Peebles. Now, it turned out that this was the Peebles ex-servicemen's pipe band that was playing in Pennycook. We moved to Peebles, and my father sent my brother and I off for piping lessons to this very same pipe band. It turned out that the magnificent drum major was in the guy who drove the cooperative bread van in Peebles. But that's where I learned my piping, basically. So it's a small local pipe band. I didn't play pibroch at all at that time because in the pipe band there wasn't much enthusiasm for pibroch, to be honest. But a friend of mine was going to an old man called Archie Newman in Peebles, who turned out to be an absolute gem of an old man. I started going to him for pibroch at about the age of 17 or 18. Unfortunately only for a year or two because he sadly died. He was very old. But he taught me the basics of pibroch, which was great. So that's how I came to it. I couldn't believe that it was possible to do a crunlua, for example. It just seems so complex and so difficult to manage.
Well, like you're saying, I remember the first time I heard somebody play an amach, and I went, how do you do that? Certainly. Now, you as well were involved in the creation of this place, the National Piping Centre, and up until this year, you were a member of the board of directors. Yes. So I'm wondering, could you tell us a little bit about the early sort of stages of the Piping Centre, the inception, because you've been involved, again, right from the start.
Yeah. Well, the original idea was to replace the old College of Piping with something a bit more modern, bigger and more commercial, and to take forward the work which Seamus McNeill and his colleagues had done in building up the College of Piping. And the people who were involved in it were Andrew McNeill from Colonsay, and Brian and Una Ivory, who were friends of Andrew McNeill, and also they engaged the interest of Sandy Grant Gordon, who was chairman of William Grant and Sons at the time, and got together a few people who formed a committee to try and explore it and take it forward, which they did do. There were quite a lot of grants available at the time for doing this type of work. The building itself was a B-listed building, but it was in a terrible state. And one of the things we remember is that Sandy Grant Gordon just came along and sat down and wrote a cheque out for £125,000 to buy the place,
Oh, wow.
just like that. Wonderful man, and very, very enthusiastic about what was being proposed. There was, from then on, several years were spent in rebuilding and refurbishing the whole building, which was essentially a case of taking it back to the shell and rebuilding the interior. And a lot of that was done by raising funds, both by public donations and also from organisations such as the Glasgow City and also European funding, which was available at the time. Much of that work was done by Brian Ivory, and Una Ivory, his wife, was responsible for overseeing the refurbishment and the building of the interior building of the facility. So that went on for several years, and during that time it became clear at one point that the College of Piping did not want at this point to come in with a new piping centre. So the two organisations went their own ways. But the piping centre has gradually gone from a building which had trees growing out the walls to a very, very well designed and fit for purpose building within. The only problem was making enough money to keep it going, which is always a challenge. We made losses for several years after getting started, but we broke even for the first time about 15 years ago, and from then on have been profitable every year but one since. Relying to some extent on funding, we receive quite substantial funding from Creative Scotland, but William Grant & Sons have been wonderful, superb supporters all the way through, and a number of other trusts and foundations have also supported us. But one of the key things about the Piping Centre is that it earns its own income through running the hotel, restaurant and shop. So it's a commercial operation as well as an educational one. Mm-hmm. But it's been a wonderful organisation to be involved with, to see its evolution and to see the success that it's had within the piping world.
Yeah, and for anybody who's curious to see sort of what you're talking about with what the piping centre looked like before it was a piping centre, there is a display in the staircase up next to the auditorium that shows the piping centre before it had been renovated. Exactly. Literally, there are trees growing out of the building, so it's incredible to see what's been done with the place. Yeah. I've heard the stories of the early days, and only having sort of one or two teachers, and not that many students to what it is now. 2 locations in the city, running Piping Live, the National Youth Pipe Band, all the projects we're involved with. I'm curious, how have you seen the Piping Centre change or develop or grow over the years? Are there any things that stand out to you about how the centre?
I think it's been more of an evolution, really. Something which has taken place over time. For example, Rory McLeod, during the time that he was principal here, developed every single different avenue for learning that you could think of, right up to postgraduate degree level. Mm-hmm. So that over time, the organisation was able to support anyone at all who wanted to learn the pipes. I think that's been one of the key things that has worked really, really well. And of course, the Piping Centre is active in other types of bagpipe as well, not only the Highland bagpipes, but bellows pipes and mouth-blown small pipes and everything else. So it's basically evolved to cover the whole range of piping. Mm-hmm. And also, I think one of the other key developments has been the invention of Piping Live, the Piping Festival, mm-hmm. Whereby people get together at the Piping Centre every year for a week, really enjoying presentations and performances at a very high level indeed. Yeah. So these are kind of key things that have happened over the time.
Yeah, sometimes we talk about it sometimes here, that it's amazing how many projects, how much is actually going on under the roof here.
Amazing, yes.
And of course with the support of the board of directors. And thank you for was it 25 years on the board that you served?
I think I first became involved in the Piping Centre in 1991, so that's about 31 years.
Jeez, oh,
the board was formed a few years after that, once at the point where we were starting to actually operate.
Yeah. Well, thank you for all that service and enjoy the retirement from the board. But your involvement with piping isn't just through the Piping Centre. You're also the chair of the music committee for the Pibroch Society.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask, the set tunes come out every year,
Yeah.
and the dedicated Pibroch competitors out there go out and learn those tunes. What is the process for selecting the tunes that go on the set list?
Okay. We have some sort of broad guidelines about what we're trying to do. We're trying to produce tunes which will give exposure to as much of the repertoire, of the Pibroch repertoire as we can over a period of time. But at the same time to get sets of tunes for the silver medal, the gold medal and the senior competitions that are balanced within themselves, so that there's a reasonable balance of degree of difficulty, if you like, within each set of tunes. And also to select tunes which will be appreciated by audiences, so there won't be the same sort of tune or the same tunes repeated all the time, to create interest for audiences and also for judges. So these are the sort of broad principles. So how do we go about it? We have a committee of about 6 people who actually are active in choosing the tunes, and what we normally do is split them into small groups of 2 or maybe 3 people, who then come back to the whole committee with a suggestion for the silver medal tunes for the following year. Same for the gold medal, same for the senior level tunes. And we then discuss them as a committee, try to make sure there's a good balance, that there's not too much repetition from over the years, and that there's variety within the tunes in terms of the range of the chanter involved. It's very easy with piping to get a whole bunch of tunes that don't go above the note E,
Yeah, yeah.
So what you want is to have, a good range of interest within the tunes. And then towards the end of each year, we come together and have a discussion about what tunes will be announced for the year following that, the next year. So they're announced a year and a half in advance. So one of the problems with it is, if you set tunes which contain very popular pieces, pipers will normally go for them. So usually
Right.
what happens is that you get a set of tunes which are broadly comparable in terms of the wider appeal of the tunes, if you like. So sometimes you get sets of tunes which are not well known and don't always go down too well. However, what we always try to do is to make these tunes interesting and find tunes which people will find challenging and which will hopefully find their way into the repertoire over the longer term.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say also, every 5 years or thereabouts, we have a known choice year, which is the intention of which is for the silver medal and the gold medal to allow competitors to choose their own tunes. And we get a huge range of tunes submitted for these.
Yeah.
And then for the first time this year, we're introducing a new approach for the senior tunes, for the clasp and senior Pibroch, whereby we've identified a list of about 60 tunes or thereabouts, which we think are at the sufficient level of demand, if you like, for the top level competitors, and we're giving them the choice to choose their tunes from this list.
Right.
With the condition that the tunes that they play at Oban and Inverness are no longer allowed to be chosen for the next 5 years at least. So we'll keep moving people on into playing different tunes and new tunes, and hopefully by doing that get more of the repertoire explored, while at the same time giving a degree of choice to the competitors that they didn't previously have.
Yeah. Well, it's
So
good
we'll see how it works.
Yeah, it's good to hear that the competitors will have that level of autonomy
Yeah.
in their sort of decision making. Now, you mentioned the experience of judges,
Yeah.
and listening to the tunes, and of course you're a judge yourself. And I wanted to ask you about judging. The majority of people who watch this program, who are involved with the competing world of piping,
Yeah.
will be competitors, because
Yeah.
the majority of players are competitors. There's not that many judges. And so we're all familiar with the challenges of being a competitor, making sure your pipes are going, making sure you know the tunes, making sure the technique is there, all these things that we have to think about and worry about. I wonder, what are the challenges of being a Pibroch or solo piping adjudicator?
I think the main thing to remember is that you're judging music, and music, in my view at least, is something that should be enjoyed by the people who listen to it. So what you want is to judge on the basis of the the musical content of the tune and the way it's presented. It's very easy with piping to look for mistakes because the pipes are a big loud instrument. Errors are very obvious sometimes, but I think that I will look on that as a negative way to judge. I think you should start from the point of view that you're looking for music and you want to get a musical presentation. One thing that I've noticed, I've been judging now for many, many years, is that nowadays the quality of the bagpipes is way, way better than it was 20, 30 years ago. So much so that almost everyone appears with a good bagpipe. The standard of technique, which is developed by pipers nowadays, again, is much more consistent and very, very reliable. So essentially you have the difficult job then of saying, what am I looking for? And what you're looking for is musical presentation. Phrasing, getting variety into the tune through different tempos for different parts of the tune, sensitive presentation of different passages within the tunes, bringing out the music is essentially what it's all about.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean,
which is subjective, of course.
Yeah, and that is maybe the challenge of it.
It is. Yeah.
But it's refreshing to hear, of course, that judges are listening for the actual music, but on the understanding that the bagpipe good is and the technique is good.
Yeah.
Now, not only have you been sitting on the other side of the bench as a judge, but you've been involved with arranging and organizing competitions, most specifically the Northern Meeting, where you were the piping convener.
Yes.
For how long?
13 years.
13 years.
Yeah.
How did you fall into that role?
I knew the previous piping convener quite well, and when I retired from my day job, he invited me to join the Northern Meeting Committee. I've been a member of the Royal Scottish Pipers Society for many years, and the convener of the Northern Meeting, ever since the war, have all been members of the Royal Scottish Pipers Society.
Right.
Which is a peculiar setup, really. And it ended with me, as it happens. But my predecessor, Richard Cameron, invited me to join the committee with a view to taking over from him 2 or 3 years down the line, which I did. I found what he'd built up for the Northern Meeting, what his predecessors had done, was very, very good. So we had an excellent setup and an excellent venue in Inverness. So I was able to take that over and take it forward from there. Mm-hmm. It's been a really, really interesting thing to do, and it's been a great privilege to do it because the Northern Meeting is one of the very top solo piping competitions in the world. And as a result of that, every piper wants to come to the Northern Meeting. Every piper wants to be there competing for the gold medal, silver medal, the March to Spain, Rio, and everything else. Judges want to judge at the Northern Meeting. So it's been a great experience to rub shoulders with all the top pipers and all the top judges, and hopefully keep the competition going in a way which is acceptable to people.
Yeah, well, it certainly doesn't seem like it's slowing down or stopping anytime soon.
The only thing I would say about it, the thing that has changed, two things have changed. One is the quality and consistency of the playing. It's a very, very high standard indeed. And in the old days, a lot of bagpipes broke down. There were some very, very good players around, obviously, but there wasn't the consistency that there is nowadays. Nowadays, you can sit and listen in very comfortable circumstances to the whole of the gold medal or the whole of the clasp or whatever, in great comfort, and excellent players come on one after the other with very good performances. So I think that's one thing that's changed. On the negative side, the thing that's changed is that fewer people are coming to listen to it. At one time, the auditorium at the Eden Court Theatre in Inverness used to be absolutely full of people. Nowadays, it's half full or even less. People are not coming to it in the way that they did 20 or 30 years ago.
Why do you think that is?
I think in the past it was genuinely looked on as a meeting. It's called the Northern Meeting, but people use it as a meeting point. And a lot of people came from the north, west and east of Scotland, congregated there, meeting old friends, renewing acquaintances and enjoying the piping. I think nowadays there are so many other things that people have to do. A lot of the older people have fallen away, and I think that the idea of coming to Inverness for 2 or 3 days doesn't seem so attractive as it once was. But I would encourage people to come, because the actual meeting element of it, the social element of it, is a big part of it, and it makes it very interesting and very rewarding and very fulfilling. So I would encourage people to come and support it on the ground, as opposed to simply hearing recordings and everything else.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You say that. One of the things that I enjoy about the World Pipe Band Championships is that it's what you're describing. It's a meeting place. Everybody comes, even if you're not competing. People will come not only to listen, but to see the people from all over the world that they haven't seen. So, yeah, maybe a shift in thinking about these competitions to sort of a more of a social gathering is a way forward.
Well, as well as being a very high level piping competition.
Of course, I mean the music is unbeatable.
Exactly.
Right. Well, thank you very much for coming in. Again, thank you for your service to piping. Between the Piping Centre, the PRIC Society, the Northern Meeting, judging, you're certainly through all of it. And just on a personal note, one of the things that I've really enjoyed about having you on the board is, every time you come in, it's not just a hello, it's a how's the piping going, what tunes are you playing, or, before this, sitting in the trice and having a coffee and just looking at old manuscripts and, being able to, as I would say, geek out about piping is much appreciated. So thank you, don't be a stranger, and thanks for coming in.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed all of the things I've done in piping, to be honest. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you.